Thanks, Bob, and to the folks that are here, it's a pleasure to be here with you. You know, I think I learned when I went to ACSC that when you ask the general officer to come speak, what you usually get is whatever his action group had slides built on already. But what I want to talk to you about a little bit is to talk about the work that the Department of Defense has done, primarily Deputy Secretary Bob work on outlining what might be in a third offset strategy, and we'll talk about that. And then talk about the work that the Air Force had done as we looked to put more strategic planning in the front of our programming and budgeting processes and to have a long-term plan for the future and how those two things are lined up. So you had several great airmen talk to you this week, starting with our secretary that talked a lot about what do we need to do in the cyber world in the big picture level, and then General Vanderham and General Harris walked us through kind of what we're doing at an operations level. I'm going to raise it back up and talk at a little bit more of a strategic level and focus on the third offset and how the Air Force interacts with it. So slide, please. Am I doing this or is somebody else doing it? Nope, we're going to do it. So if you can see these slides, the problem that we're setting to solve is that we have a changing context in the world again and the reemergence of great powers. So for 25 years, we could pretty much assume that we were going to be totally superior to anybody that we might engage against, that it wasn't a question of whether we were going to win or not, it was going to be how long it would take us to achieve our objectives. People wrote about the end of history and there was no great power challenger to the United States. Now what we're seeing though is that if you look on the left side there, certainly with Russia's actions in the Crimea and kind of pioneering a new way to achieve objectives without triggering a response from the West, or with what China's doing in the South China Sea at reclaiming territory or adding territory on top of rocks in the Pacific and trying to extend their reach. By doing that, both Russia and China have developed new technology, but more importantly than that, new ways to try to operate in the world below the threshold of a response from the Western powers. They've coupled that with new technology, and what that means is that our technological advantage, the kind of 25-year head start that we had, if you look back at Desert Storm, when the Soviet Union crumbled and we were left with a military that was built to fight them in Europe and was now completely superior to anything that our potential adversaries could put in front of us, that gap has narrowed, and it's narrowing faster every year, surprisingly fast, to the point that when we made a decision as a nation to curtail the F-22 program and move forward and accelerate the F-35 program, we did that based on a belief that we had about 15 years before anybody could field a competitor to the F-22. And then in the 5 years or so since then, we've seen that China's fielding 2 or 3. The Russians have put a couple out there that can challenge that capability that we have. And then finally, as a planner and as a money planner, we're in a position where the way we acquire systems and the way we have done it for the last 50 years won't work as we go into the future. It takes too long, and so we look too far into the future for set requirements. They're very difficult to achieve, and you end up with programs that are over budget, over time, and deliver capabilities that may not be relevant into the context that you need. Slide, please. So the idea of a third offset, and from Secretary Carter, is to look at a framework for military innovation, and I'll underline technology, concepts, and organization. Not just technology, which is what we typically focus on, but taking new ideas and technology, combining them with new ways to use them, and changing our organizational structure to fit so that we can address this new world that we're not alone as a great power. And so how can we take what we have, what we can get to in a relatively short period, combine it with new ideas and new organizations to deter great power conflict? Slide, please. So in the context of a third offset, why a third offset? So if you read through this, and you guys are probably ahead on me here, but if you think about the first offset was we squared off against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in Europe, and we knew that we could not put enough people in the field to match the numerical advantage that they possessed. And so in order to provide an affordable deterrent, we took our strategic nuclear weapons and we missionized them into a tactical nuclear weapon force so that we could extend our deterrence from the United States to Europe, and we could deter a Russian invasion without trying to put the same size force in the field. Russia also worked and deployed similar capabilities. We found ourselves in the 70s then, moving to the next idea. And the next idea took advantage of some improvements in technology, primarily stealth or reduced cross-section on platforms where you could defeat radars, and precision weapons, or what the Department of Defense at the time called weapons of near zero miss, and combine those together to where we could go put a weapon exactly on a target that we wanted to against almost any threat. So we moved from being a military that would count the number of airplanes it took to hit a target to a military that could think about how many targets can you hit with one airplane on one sortie. But again, our enemies had time to adapt to that, and in this 25th anniversary of Desert Storm, as we look back at it, it was a defining time for our military, but it was also a defining time for people that watch us. So if you're one of the rising great powers, if you're Russia or China, the lesson was you can't afford to let the United States fight the way that it wants to fight. And if Desert Storm was our model, that meant we'll have 5 or 6 months to pull resources together and to train and to think through what we want to do. We'll move close to where we want to be and use our logistics ability to do that. When we're ready, we'll unleash a powerful tidal wave of precision weapons, overwhelm your defenses, and move to an inexorable result. So if you're Russia, you didn't think we could make stealth work. You knew we were trying it, but you didn't think we could make stealth work. You got a wake-up call in Desert Storm. And so you did things like moving the radars in your surface-to-air defenses out of band. We know that we have built radars, both air-to-air radars and surface-to-air radars, that were optimized for what's the best frequency to work through the air. And we had built our stealth systems optimized on those same frequencies because that's where the radars were. So if you're Russia, you move those out of band, you accept some inefficiency, but you learn how to do it better, and so you go below that band and above that band into the places that make it difficult for us. You integrate together low frequency, long wavelength radars with the shorter ones that can target, and you build new integrated air defense systems, and you think about new ways to operate below that deterrent level. If you're China, they looked at the distance problem and they said the answer is don't let them get close. And so they invested in a range of weapons that make it very difficult to base close enough to have a persistent effect. If you were not a peer adversary, the lesson might have been, if you're, say, Iraq or Iran or North Korea, the lesson was don't fight the United States without a nuclear weapon of your own because you cannot deter them without one. And so we saw North Korea work to acquire a nuclear weapon. We saw Iran and Iraq pursue programs and be discouraged in different means from pursuing those. And so people learned, they watched, and they've worked to try to counter our strengths. So if we're going to move to a third offset, I'd propose that because of the world we live in now that you know very well, driven by Moore's Law, where computer power doubles every 18 months or every 2 years, to start working on a third technological offset would mean you better be working on the fourth or fifth one at the same time because of the rapid change. So as we move forward, we think technology will still matter, but it'll be technologically enabled concepts. It'll be new ways to think about bringing our tools together is what will provide the advantage for us in the immediate future. Slide, please. So again, tracing back to the Secretary of Defense, and the same kind of work that we did as we were working through resetting strategy in the Air Force is we wanted to refocus on great powers that pose an existential threat to the United States. Not that we can ignore the issues out there, and the Secretary of Defense has lumped the threats he's asked us to plan against into 5, and they make an acronym called CRICKET that you'll hear people talk about, but China, Russia, Iran, Korea, and the continuing counterterrorism fight. We still have to be able to work in all those areas, but we had lost our focus on the great powers, and we want to refocus to have capability there. It means that we need to innovate not just in technology, but in concepts, in organization, and in culture, and be prepared to think our way through the problems. And it means that we must rely on the ingenuity that's unique to our American economy, to our Western democracies, to what you bring to developing the systems that we'll need and ways to use them, and what our airmen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines bring to learning how to fight with them. So that means that the strategic approach, in operations concepts, at the tactical level, and in technology. And so if we're thinking about a future then, what do you think that future will look like, and how do you decide? As part of our strategic planning process, we built an Air Force future operating concept. And it's one idea of what the future would look like, and it's one idea of how your Air Force might operate in that future. We can't predict exactly what it'll look like, but we wanted to have something to aim for. We wanted to have a star to follow out there. So slide, please. And when we sat down and looked at what was in the third offset work that the department was doing and what was in our work that led up to the future operating concept, we saw a lot of it came together to the point that the Deputy Secretary said, hey, this is, I would say, a manifestation of the third offset strategy, not necessarily the, but it's a manifestation. And now let's talk about that a little bit. Slide, please. So as I said, we were working along together, and we ended up coming to the same place because we're looking at the same problem with a lot of the same data. So we got to similar conclusions. There's a strong alignment between the department's work on human-machine collaboration, which is right up your alley, manned and unmanned teaming, and our idea of performance-optimized teams that I'll talk about. We want to think deeply and thoughtfully about what is the right mix between combining what humans do best and what machines do best, not just in the combat arena with manned and unmanned teaming, RPAs and manned vehicles together, robots and manned vehicles together, but in the process that we use for command and control. Can we use machines to go through big data to crank away and decide where a watch officer should look for something that might happen? Where are the problem areas? Where should you focus your attention on? Can we use a machine that would say, when something does happen, work quickly to put some COAs together that can then be delivered to a human decision maker to say, okay, do I want to pick A, B, C, or D? Can we do things in the mobility world at the tactical level down to is a machine able to better optimize which boxes go on which airplane, and how do you fit the space and the weight to do the most efficient use of your resources? And then finally, in combat operations, do we have some advantages if we pair a manned aircraft with unmanned aircraft, or manned ground systems and unmanned ground systems, to move forward, get an advantage over the enemy with the minimum loss of human life on both sides? So where did that AFOC come from, and how do we get to it? Slide, please. So as I said, we worked through a process. It started, of course, with the Defense Department and the President's guidance to us. We spent a year or two working on who are we and trying to be clear in our mind what airmen do and what we deliver to the Joint Force and why. What are the important things that we do and why do they matter to the Joint Force? We did a look at what the future will be in our Afcea and our future environment assessment. That led us to a strategy and a master plan. It's a master plan with a top document and then 4 annexes, one in human capital. How will we develop the airmen of the future to operate in this environment? How will we posture our forces? What will the bases look like? Where will they be? What capabilities do we need, which is traditionally where we focus. What stuff are we going to buy for airmen to operate? And then the science and technology. How should we invest our money for the future? And how do we make sure that all of these are aligned to a strategy? And then from that, we wanted to look 20 years out in the future and say, hey, if we're successful at doing the things that we've laid out in this strategy, what would the Air Force look like and how would it fight in that time frame? So slide, please. So this is my best attempt, at a good Army slide with a whole lot of stuff on it. And I'll kind of walk you through how we would tie it together, and I'll see how the builds work here. But we thought about, in our strategy, we came to the conclusion that the Air Force needed to become more strategically agile. We needed to be able to not have a 25-year worldview driven by Desert Storm that drove us to one way of employing, but to be able to provide a range of responses for Joint Force commanders, to be able to look into multi-domain solutions, not just air solutions, but air, space, and cyber solutions, and to be able to rapidly shift from one to the other, and to change the Air Force as the world changes. When we looked into the operational environment, we decided the counterpart of that was to be able to do that last part, which is provide multiple solutions for Joint Force commanders and be able to rapidly shift our weight of effort between them. So we wanted to think about, what does agility mean? So build, please. You can go ahead and build all 5 of those. So back up if you would and just build that facets of agility there. So we said, okay, agility means being flexible, it means being able to act fast, it means to be coordinated in your actions, it means to be balanced so you don't get knocked off your feet, and then ultimately you need to be able to deliver strength. So when we looked at our AFOC, we tried to align 5 things that are important for the future with that. So the operational applications were for flexibility. It was to be able to provide integrated multi-domain operations. Again, aerospace and cyber working as part of the joint team. For speed, it was to accelerate our decision speed, and that's where some of the automation and human teaming come in our command and control process. For coordination, it was moving from a one-size-fits-all command and control process, an AOC that's pretty well worked out, TACPs down at the Army unit level that are pretty well worked out, but to be able to be more flexible in between, to be able to shift and provide commanders at different levels, the planning and the command and control that we need to bring what airmen bring to the joint fight. For balance, it was a balanced capabilities mix to look at, do we have the balance right between our high-end capabilities and our low-end capabilities, between our long-range capabilities and our short-range capabilities, between our multi-role general capabilities or between the specific specialized capabilities that you need in certain areas. And then finally, in strength, it was how to bring the power of airmen together with technology in our weapons, but with new technologies in human-machine interface to try to make them smarter, better, faster. And then as you push that across the 5 missions of the Air Force that you see vertically there, our 5 missions were given to us in 1947, and it was air superiority at the time. We add space superiority to that now. Global mobility, global ISR, global strike to be able to hit any target in the world, and then the command and control to make it happen. We modify those slightly in our AFOC, so we talk about multi-domain command and control. We talk about adaptive domain control, which means air and space, and how much of it do you need and where do you need it? Can you adapt it to do that? Global integrated ISR stays the same, mobility stays the same, and precision strike stays the same. So you take those 5 Air Force Corps missions, and now you want to be agile, and you want to operate in all 3 domains across those missions to deliver the global vigilance, global reach, global power that the Air Force provides to the Joint Force. So a lot to look at on that slide, but not really very complicated. It's taking the idea of agility, saying what does that mean for an Air Force? How does it apply to all 5 of our core missions that we provide? And then how will we shape that in the future? Slide, please. So we start with strategic agility. We have to have an Air Force that can support this and change it. We did a 20-year look as we talked about. And then we tried to focus on capabilities and not platforms. You know, one of the criticisms that are probably fair of the Air Force is that we tend to talk about manning equipment instead of equipping airmen. And we want to change that focus to where we think about what are the concepts that make technology work, and how do we provide technology and tools for airmen to go achieve the goals that they need. So we tried not to name specific platforms. We do have kind of a notional F-35D. We do mention the C-130J in here, but for the most part, we make up names for new things, and we talk about new capabilities and not new systems. And we wanted to focus on the airmen and the concepts of how we'd approach it. So slide, please. Kind of hard to read, but as we went through it, we wanted to make it real to airmen. We wanted to make it something that they could read and see themselves in and think about being an airman of the future. So we added vignettes, and if you have a chance to read it, there's the blue background as you flip through it. If you just want to read that part, these are the vignettes that try to make something real into the future. So in this vignette, you got a couple of F-35s that are out there in the future. They're controlling multiple mission long-range uninhabited aircraft that are with them. They're teamed with RPAs that are being directed from back in the United States somewhere. And as they're moving to solve that problem, they've worked together. And as the command center is working to fight off the cyber attempts to take down the links that allow them to communicate. They're shifting from link to link. And at one point in this vignette, the RPA link is cut back to the United States, and so the guys in the battlefield take over that system and direct it from their airplane to achieve the objective. So we wanted to focus on capabilities. We wanted to focus on airmen and not technology, but we want to prepare our airmen to think about how we'll work in the future. And frankly, we wanted to give you some ideas about where we're trying to go so that it'll be real to you and your folks so that you can help provide the systems that'll help us get there. So that's the vision of the AFOC. And as we move forward in the brief now, let's shift to how do we execute that and what will we have to change in the Air Force to be a strategically agile and a more operationally agile force. Slide, please. So you heard our secretary talk about breaking the cost curve. She did a great job walking through it, and I'll try not to duplicate too much of her effort. But you've also heard both Secretary James and Chief Wells talk a lot about partnering with industry, that we realize what we do depends on a good partnership and a good understanding between airmen and the people that build the tools that we use. And we're going to continue to move forward there. And then the DepSecDef identified 5 kind of immediate areas that he thought we could work together with industry, and those are listed there. So learning systems that can look at a complex sets of data, look at them over time, find the patterns, and help humans sort through it. Collaboration between people and machines. Assisted human ops, which might mean with data automation, but it also might mean the exoskeletal suits that SOCOM is working on. Teaming manned and unmanned systems like we talked about in that vignette. And then network enabling our weapons, sensors, and platforms so that you're not tying a weapon to a particular sensor to a particular platform, but that they can all work together to get sensors in the right place, to have platforms where you need them, and then to use the weapons interchangeably among them. Slide, please. So a couple of specific instances of how we'll try to work to do that. One of them is a Small Business Innovation Research Fund. And this is designed to help new companies with new ideas get into our process and provide some seed contracts to do that. Along the way, we'll encourage open architecture work so that small companies can help us on bigger systems and plug into things that we have. And we want to help them work together and with government sponsors to bring us new ideas and not just new pieces of equipment. Slide, please. The next one you've heard a couple of folks talk about, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. It's a kind of a DoD outpost set out in Silicon Valley to try to link us with non-traditional sources of defense innovation, to bring the requirements of the department and the needs of the department out into non-traditional places, and then to try to learn not just what they can do, but how they're able to field systems faster than we're able to, and to try to bring some of those components into what we're doing. So the next thing I'll talk about is, coming back again to the third offset. Why do we need to do anything different? Why can't we just keep advancing along the lines we've been advancing on and hold our advantage there? So let's talk about that for a minute. So slide, please. I'll kind of use the analogy of a car, and if you'll bear with me here as we work through it. So in the top left-hand corner, when we first started making cars, some of them had 3 wheels, some of them had 4 wheels, some of them had a tiller, some of them had a steering wheel, some of them had a steam engine, some of them had some kind of fossil fuel engine. But very quickly, we kind of figured out what worked best, and pretty soon a car had 4 wheels, it had a steering wheel, it had a gasoline engine. If you could drive one car, you could drive any car. And the cars that result from that, look pretty much the same. My guys threw in the flux capacitor there. So there might be a break there. But next build, a car is a car. And if you can drive one car, you can drive any car. And for 98% of what they do, they're all interchangeable. There might be a case for a Ferrari somewhere, but for most of us, that's an indulgence and not a need. And the value that was added by manufacturers is in consumer electronics, mostly, is how you charge more for one or differentiate yourself. The basic idea of a car was worked out in the 30s, and it hasn't changed much. And it won't change much until Google and Uber come together to make it an app where you call for transportation and a robot car shows up on your front step and you get in it and it takes where you need to go and you get out. You don't need a car of your own. Slide, please. So if you think about the airplane in that context, the first airplanes, some of them had the horizontal stabilizer in the front, some of them had it in the back, some of them you steered by warping the wings, some you steered with ailerons, some of them you wore a hip belt and you shifted your weight to change the wings and make the turn. We got to a stick or a wheel pretty quick. By the end of World War I, pursuit planes looked pretty much the same because the engineering brought them to the same solution with the technology that was available. By the end of World War II, you had to paint invasion stripes on the Allied airplanes because it was hard to tell them apart, even at a 500-foot gun range, because designers had, again, pushed technology down to the same place. And Bill, please. If you work through the fourth generation fighters, you get to the point where I'd be at red flag saying, Fox 2 kill on the F-5, I mean the F-18, I mean the F-16 over the farms because they all look so much the same. And if you look at the 5th gen fighters that we fielded, plus the 5th gen prototypes that are being fielded by the Chinese and the Russians, they've got 2 angled tails, they've got a horizontal stabilizer way back to get the most leverage that you can. They may or may not have some kind of thrust vectoring depending on how much you want to pay for it. They have intakes that are shielded in some way for radar cross-section, and they look a lot the same because, again, the engineering takes you to the same place with some maybe divergences there. Slide, please. One more. And so you look at airplanes that look a whole lot the same. So what does that mean for us? Slide. Yep, and so this one kind of shows again that they look a whole lot the same. Slide, please. That's the Russian equivalent. Slide, please. That's the Chinese equivalent. Slide, please. And this one's really interesting. On the left side, you've got an F-35. On the right side, you've got the Chinese equivalent. So some of that is, again, engineers being pushed to the same place. Some of it may or may not be stealing intellectual property, to get to that. But either way, it takes you to the same place. And the reason why that's important is that if you look at the curve then for the automobile on the bottom or for the airplane on the top, it means that we're in a world now where if we want to get any more performance out of a car or an airplane, to get this much more performance in the horizontal axis, you got to put this much more money into it to squeeze any more juice out of that lemon. And so we're not going to do that. We can't do that. As a young engineer, I was taught that you buy airplanes by the pound in that time. The bigger an airplane is, the more it weighs, the more you're going to pay for it. Next, I learned that in our development model now, you pay for an airplane by the number of years you spend developing it. You've got to take all that R&D, all those engineers that you kept working for 20 years, amortize that across a limited number of airplanes you bought, and it doubles the cost of the airplane. And now we're moving into a world where you measure the cost by the lines of software code. The touch labor is being removed by robots that build the airplane, and now the money goes into paying those programmers to make millions of lines of software code work. All of that takes us to a point where airplanes will continue to advance some, and we'll still have to buy airplanes, but there's still going to be an airplane, and there's not going to be a giant technological advantage creating by pushing it that next inch on the line. So we'll think about sensors. We'll think about the weapons that go into it. We'll think about how we tie them together. And we'll think about how we use the tools that you're building for us in big data and in networks to be able to make them work better. Slide, please. So as I wrap up here, again, that AFOC drives for us a look at the future. And the next thing we're doing then is we're commissioning what we call capability collaboration teams, or enterprise capability collaboration teams. And yep, just like the flux capacitor vehicle I showed, it is kind of back to the future for us. We found that we gave up some of this capability when we combined our logistics command with systems command to get a materiel command. Part of what we lost were the operators, engineers, and industry together to take a look at where our future opportunities and gaps were, and to set priorities, what we used to do with Project Vanguard, to line out the key areas for us to focus. So the first area we picked to look at was Air Superiority 2030. We've completed about a year-long study, and what we wanted to do was take a step back, and instead of jumping straight into an analysis of alternatives for a follow-on fighter that would probably cost $250 million a copy and would be unaffordable, we wanted to step back and look at multi-domain, all the tools that are available to us, and think about what will be required to provide air superiority for the joint force in the future. How will we do it? What are the tools that we bring to bear, and think through that process. A team did an excellent job led by Colonel Alex Grinkowicz. They've laid that out very well. We've briefed the first look of that out to the chief. I expect to be able to get that out to industry sometime this spring and share the ideas that we came up with there and get your ideas back. And then we're going to move into commissioning the next two teams. And we'll have a process in the A58 that brings industry, academia, government, and our sister services together to identify the next couple areas that we're going to look at, and then kind of work through 2 of these a year over the next 5 or 6 years to get at the big areas that we need to get to make the AFOC a reality. And so a short example here, the kind of thing we're talking about again, our goal is to bring multi-domain together to accomplish the missions that we're expected to perform. And in the little vignette here, you've got an air-launched hypersonic missile that's destroying an enemy laser that's targeting one of our satellites, and that is being locked in place so that it can't target one of our satellites by a cyber attack long enough for us to kill it with a kinetic weapon. So again, our goal is to look at the multi-domain approaches to bring space, air, and cyber together, but not just for that sake, but to provide the freedom of action that the Joint Force expects us to provide so that we can be successful in the future. So that's kind of a brief look at how the Air Force sees the third offset and our role in it. I wanted to lay out for you a little bit about how we're trying to move forward into the future, both where we're trying to get and how we're trying to get there. I'll reiterate that we won't get there without your help. You provide the engine that makes that work, and I'll be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, sir. You didn't mention unmanned aircraft and its impact on the Air Force future operating concept. Are there any evolutionary or revolutionary impacts expected or predicted?
Thank you. So actually I did. I talked about the multi-mission long-range aircraft and manned and unmanned teaming. So we think our view is that it's not so much an issue of manned versus unmanned, it's manned and unmanned together, and how will you build partnerships to do that. In the vignette in our AFOC, basically it's a couple of manned fighters that are controlling loyal wingmen, something like 4 or 6 or 8 aircraft unmanned that have similar performance characteristics. And the idea is that you have 2 quarterbacks in the manned airplanes that are sending the unmanned airplanes out either to move their weapons launch envelopes out in front of them, or to move sensors out in front of them so that they can provide weapons from further back, or to tell them to go look at a target and see what's happening with their onboard sensors, or to tell them to go attack a target with the links that are there. So you'll see us trying to look at what is that right balance and how do we optimize the use of manned and unmanned together and not pit manned and unmanned aircraft against each other.
Thank you, sir. In light of all fiscal and security challenges the nation faces, how likely is it that Congress will fund the DoD to the level needed?
So one of the big issues that we face, and you'll hear it, is that the first thing I would like to have as a strategic planner and as a program content planner is predictability. So, I'd like to have more. Everybody would like to have more. But more important than having more is knowing how much I'm going to have so that I can make a plan into the future that I can execute and that I can control my appetite based on what I think the top line will be and work within that. And that's the main problem with the Budget Control Act. We appreciate the relief that we get in a balanced budget amendment and an agreement, but if there's no further action taken, then the Budget Control Act kicks in again in 18 and 19, and we're back in the same place we were, where we're building a plan without knowing what our top line will be. So the first thing we'd like help with is predictability. The next thing then is we know that because of a 20-year kind of procurement holiday in the Air Force, in the 20 years prior to Desert Storm, the Air Force bought about 200 fighter aircraft a year. In the 20 years since then, we bought about 20 fighter aircraft a year, which means the average age of our fleet, is going up at a really steep angle because of the math inherent there. Those airplanes will start to age out in what we call the second fight up from now. So the plan that we've delivered now, 17 through 21, the next 5 years after that, starting in 22, those airplanes will start to age out. We've waited so long that there won't be enough money out there to replace them all with new airplanes. So it means we're going to have to take action to extend the service life of those older airplanes. And then when we do that, we're going to have to give them more capability so that they can still be useful in that area. You'll never be able to get an improved F-15 or F-16 into the same place that you can get an F-22 or an F-35, but they don't all have to be in that toughest environment. So we'll invest in radars and radar warning receivers and computers to be able to tie those together and into some updates for those. And then that comes together, as the questioner points out, at the same time as our nuclear enterprise bills all come due. So if you read the paper, the department estimates somewhere between 12 and 18 billion a year would be required to recapitalize the nuclear enterprise on top of normal spending, or we'll have to take a 12 or 18 billion a year cut out of our conventional spending in that portfolio. So that's a decision for the nation to make, not the Air Force and not really even the Department of Defense. It's how much are we willing to spend to provide 21st century deterrence and to provide that both in the nuclear regime and in the conventional forces that provide deterrence as well. And that won't be my call. I think the nation will come through with the money that it needs to provide an adequate defense for the country, and we'll work within that budget level that we're given.
Thank you. Next question. How has the Air Force brought lessons from our current counter-terrorist fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS into its strategic planning and investment choices for the Air Force future operating concept?
So thank you. One of the choices that we're going to have to make, and as we brought planning into our process a little more, I say in 858 we're time travelers. We're basically working in 3 different time horizons at any one time. So our 17 to 21 POM is over with Congress, and that lays out a 5-year plan, with the first year being the most important to Congress. Our 18 to 22 plan that we built, we're in the process of building now, will be turned in June. We planned it last year. It's being turned into a program this year. We'll work through modifications of that with the Department of Defense. It'll become a president's budget. And then we're a good 3 months into planning the 19 5-year plan. So you look at all 3 of those together and you try to keep them straight and keep them aligned with each other, knowing that Congress changes one and you got to ripple those into your other one. The department makes changes in 18 and you got to ripple that into your 19 plan. And as you look at the future then and you make your assumptions, and I am getting to that question, the big question you've got to make in our planning process is, this year, instead of providing an optimized program for 18 that kind of sub-optimizes in each area to try to not hurt anyone too bad, we're going to provide some broader courses of action that would say, do you want to lean the Air Force toward an all high-end force and accept risk at the low end in that long-term counterterrorism fight, or do you want to lean the Air Force toward the counterterrorism fight and accept some risk in the other ones? What would that look like in either case, and how would you do it? And so we'll look at whether we should procure some dedicated assets that are designed just for that counterterrorism fight to do it cheaper within the reduced threat there, or whether we'll have the money available to do that. And the specific lessons learned we bring back in, I think, are we basically have changed all the platforms into the Air Force into where they have really good capability to support a ground fight. And what does that specifically mean? It means the Strike Eagle that I went to combat in Afghanistan as the wing commander there didn't have, before we got into this fight, it didn't have the right radios to be able to talk to ground commanders. It didn't have the optics and a targeting pod to be able to see what you need to see and put bombs where you needed to go. It originally didn't have the precision weapons that you need to put effects precisely where you needed them. But over the course of time, we've added advanced targeting pods so that the crew can see things from close up. We've added the right radios so that in my Strike Eagle I could be talking VHF to a platoon leader while I was talking UHF to the TAC-P where the battalion commander and the JTAC were sitting, and talking UHF SATCOM over the ridge to the Air Operations Squadron that was telling me where to go for my next tasking. So I think we've incorporated the lessons on how to be effective there, and if you watch the news and you see a strike made against a terrorist training camp in Libya or in Yemen, we have the global reach to be able to put resources there, whether it's an unmanned aircraft employing a Hellfire or a 500-pound laser-guided bomb, or whether it's one of our traditional CAF assets that has the ability to go find and hit those targets. I think we've learned to do that very quickly and very well, almost too well, to the point that we've transitioned so much of our traditional targeting enterprise over to analyzing hours and hours of full motion video and making assumptions there, that when it's time to go pursue a broader target set against Daesh in Iraq and Syria that are trying to control territory and act like a government, we're having to go back and rebuild some of that traditional targeting process that you would expect the Air Force to have. So I think we've learned a lot from 20 years of engagement. We've learned how to provide the minimum airmen required to do the job, but to get them there so that we can keep a rotational base. And we've learned that we cannot stay ready to fight a peer adversary and deploy at the same ops tempo that we're deploying at in the counterterrorism fight. The two run into each other, and you have to accept risk in one or the other. So I'll stop there. Next.
Thank you. That was our final question for General